You know how sometimes you get these like geopolitical things happening and you're just supposed to like understand it all right away? Well, today we're diving into one where it's not just about, looking at a map. It's about the Russo-Ukrainian War and how it's shaking up the Orthodox Church, which is kind of wild when you really get into it.
And the thing is, this isn't just about like a country being divided. It's way deeper than that. We're talking about the potential fracturing of faith itself. Because, see, the Orthodox Church, it doesn't quite work like, say, Catholicism with the Pope calling all the shots from the Vatican.
So it's not like one big happy pizza, more like
Mhm.
a bunch of different slices, but some slices are like way more important than others.
Exactly. You got it. And two of the biggest players in this whole thing, those would be the patriarchates of Moscow and Constantinople.
Hmm.
Historically, they haven't exactly been best buddies, and this whole war situation, let's just say it's not exactly helping things.
Yeah, our source for this deep dive is definitely concerned about that. They're anxious about the West and its role for sure. But the main thing they keep coming back to is how this all impacts the future of, well, orthodoxy itself, especially in Ukraine.
Which brings us to a really significant event. The whole Orthodox Church of Ukraine situation, the OCU. They got established back in 2018, and that wasn't just some like administrative change. It was a major shift that basically drove a wedge right through the heart of Ukrainian Orthodoxy.
Because before that, most of it was under Moscow's influence, right? Almost like history repeating itself in a way, since like way back when religious authority originally went from Kyiv to Moscow.
Right, it's like this echo from the past. Now, our source, they dream of seeing the Ukrainian Orthodox Church all back together, unified under Moscow again. They even suggest, and this is where it gets a bit, well, tricky, that the war, as awful as it is, might actually make that happen. But, and they admit this themselves, it's super unlikely.
Yeah, that's what I appreciated about their writing, the honesty. They don't sugarcoat it. They lay out all the reasons why, even if, hypothetically speaking, Russia achieves its goals in the war, this whole church split probably isn't going away anytime soon. It goes way beyond just land and territory.
Totally. It's about legitimacy,
Yeah.
in the eyes of the entire Orthodox world. Even if, say, the OCU just disappeared tomorrow, Constantinople, which was the one who gave it the thumbs up in the first place, they're not going to just forget about it. The damage is done, so to speak.
And then on top of all that, there's this concept of surgeonism, which, I'll be honest, I had to look up. It's not some obscure heavy metal band, which is what I was kind of hoping for.
Right. Not quite. It's this whole thing stemming from the Soviet era. Basically, it's the idea that the Russian Orthodox Church back then was pretty much a puppet of the state, doing whatever the government wanted. And now, with the war going on, some people are looking at the church and saying, hold on a minute, is this happening all over again?
Yeah, especially since our source points to Metropolitan Onufry, the head honcho of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church under Moscow. He straight up condemned the invasion.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, you've got priests and whatnot distancing themselves from the Moscow Patriarch, even refusing to acknowledge him.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty intense stuff.
Right. And here's where it gets really nuanced. Our source, they don't come right out and say, this is Surgeonism 2.0. They recognize the church and the state in Russia are pretty cozy, but it's like they're wrestling with the implications of it all in real time.
That's that tension, isn't it?
Yeah.
Supporting Russia in this whole thing, but also realizing the potential damage it could do to the church's reputation, not just within Russia, but globally. It's a tightrope walk and one wrong step.
Mm.
Yikes.
And it leads to this question of a potential power shift. Like, what if, as a result of all this, the Russian Orthodox Church ends up getting isolated? Could that open the door for Constantinople to swoop in and become the main power player in the Orthodox world? That's a whole other can of worms.
Whoa. Okay, yeah, that would be huge. But what would that even look like in practice?
Oh, think about it. It would impact everything. We're talking about how churches relate to each other, how other Orthodox nations see Moscow as authority. I mean, this isn't some internal church squabble. This could reshape religious alliances across the globe. It's big.
And just when you think it can't get any wilder, our source drops this bombshell. There's a rumor going around about a possible reunification council between the Catholics and the Orthodox in 2025. Is that even, like, a thing that could happen? Seriously.
It's definitely intriguing, and our source seems pretty uneasy about it, to be honest. They see parallels to the Uniate Church of Ukraine, which, in their view, has become way too westernized, like straying from its Orthodox roots. And this council, they worry it could lead to something similar for the whole of Orthodoxy.
So it's not just two faiths deciding to be friends. It's about the possibility of orthodoxy losing itself in the mix, becoming something else entirely.
Exactly. And this is where you really start to see our sources' deepest anxieties about the future of their faith come to the surface. I mean, they're living through a war that could literally reshape what it means to be Orthodox. It's a lot.
It's almost like their whole world is getting turned upside down, and they're just trying to, like, grab onto something, anything to make sense of it all.
And right when things couldn't seem more uncertain, you have Pope Francis with this whole consecration thing, planning to consecrate both Russia and Ukraine to the Immaculate Heart of Mary.
Okay, so that's very much a Catholic thing to do. How does our source coming from the Orthodox side of things, how do they even make sense of that?
To them, it's not just some symbolic gesture. It's a very deliberate move by the Pope, almost like he's passing judgment on Russia publicly. I mean, he could have done this at any point during his time as Pope, right? But to do it now, in the thick of all this conflict, it speaks volumes.
And then there's that whole prophecy element with Fatima about Russia being converted. Our source actually goes into whether or not a previous pope already fulfilled that prophecy back in the 80s. It's pretty wild.
Oh, yeah. That's where things get really fascinating. Within Catholicism, there's this whole debate about whether or not Pope John Paul II actually nailed it back in '84 during a consecration ceremony. Some people are like, yep, he totally did it. But others, including our source, argue that he didn't follow the exact instructions given in the Fatima apparition. It's all very precise.
So it's like a theological technicality with huge consequences, potentially. Did he use the right wording? Did he do the consecration the right way? Our source even brings up the idea that maybe the whole Russia thing, maybe it meant Russia returning to Orthodoxy, not converting to Catholicism. It's a whole other layer.
Right. It just goes to show how differently people interpret Fatima and how relevant it still is today. But even setting aside the whole prophecy debate, this new consecration from Pope Francis, it taps into a deep-seated fear our source keeps coming back to, this idea of forced conversion in Russia.
And that fear just feeds directly into their worries about this potential Catholic Orthodox reunification thing.
Right.
It's not just about two different branches of Christianity getting along. It's about Orthodoxy potentially being absorbed, losing its own distinct identity. At least that's how they see it.
Exactly. And they point to the Uniate Church of Ukraine as an example of this happening. To them, it's become way too westernized, like it's lost that core Orthodox identity. They even mention a Uniate Church that's incorporated charismatic worship, which is like more of a Protestant thing. It's like this blending of traditions that makes them uneasy.
So you have this underlying fear that Orthodoxy is going to lose its way, get watered down by all these external forces, whether it's influence from the West or this possible merger with Catholicism. It's a lot to process.
And it really all comes down to this fundamental core that seems to be haunting our source. What does the future hold for Orthodoxy? With this war, they see it as a turning point, a moment where the very essence of their faith is hanging in the balance.
It really makes you think, sitting here, it's like we take it for granted in the West, this whole religious freedom thing. Our source is dealing with a reality where their faith is caught in the middle of these global power struggles. That's got to be heavy.
Yeah, it really highlights how fragile religious autonomy can be, especially when you've got these massive political forces at play. The source even suggests that some Orthodox churches might feel pressured to pick a side, even if it means going against their own beliefs.
That's just, man, that's tough. What would that even do to a faith in the long run? If Orthodoxy ends up even more divided, what happens to it?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And our source really grapples with this. They acknowledge just how bad it could get. More division, a weakening of orthodoxy as a whole. It's definitely a possibility, but...
But there's that but. Even with all the doom and gloom, you can still sense their faith. Like this underlying belief that even if everything falls apart, something will survive.
Exactly. It's powerful. And that's what makes this so much more than just some geopolitical analysis. It's deeply personal. This is someone's faith being tested in the most extreme way imaginable.
And that's what these deep dives are all about, right? Going beyond the headlines, beyond the talking heads, and getting to the human side of things. Because at the end of the day, these global events, they're playing out in real people's lives.
And in this case, it's a war that could end up changing not just borders, but the very soul of this ancient faith. It's a lot to take in.
It really is. So as we come up for air from this deep dive, I'm left with this thought, something our source said that really stuck with me. What if they've got it all backward? What if instead of destroying Orthodoxy, this war actually ends up making it stronger? All this fear, all this uncertainty, what if it leads to a revival of faith, a return to tradition?
Something
Something to think about, right?
Definitely. It's an interesting question, and I think only time will tell how this conflict will ultimately shape the future of Orthodoxy.